You ever feel like the economy is this huge, complicated machine, and you just want to understand the basics without getting lost in endless jargon?
Yeah, it can definitely feel that way.
That's what we're tackling today. Think of this as your cheat sheet to understanding the ups and downs of the economy, the cycles of growth, and those inevitable slowdowns we call recessions.
Kind of like getting a handle on why the financial seasons change.
Exactly. We're diving into economic cycles and recessions, not as abstract theories, but as real forces that shape our financial world.
Absolutely. Whether you're making business plans, thinking about your career, or just trying to, decipher the news, understanding these rhythms is pretty crucial.
And our goal today, drawing from a really helpful article by SideBySide, is to cut through the complexity.
Right.
We want to extract the essential knowledge about these economic shifts so you can feel confident and informed about what's happening and what might be coming.
So we'll be exploring the long history of these cycles, looking at the different stages they go through.
Figuring out what actually causes an economy to slide into a recession.
Yeah, and the real impact these downturns have on people's lives. We'll even touch on that tricky question of whether we can see them coming.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. It turns out this whole boom and bust cycle isn't some newfangled thing.
Oh, not at all. People have been observing these patterns of, good economic times followed by tougher times for centuries, long before we had formal economics as a field.
But the actual term business cycle, that came later.
It didn't really take hold until the 19th century. You see, the Industrial Revolution, with its massive leaps in production and more interconnected markets, well, it also brought greater economic swings.
More volatility alongside the growth.
Exactly. Periods of rapid growth were often followed by pretty sharp downturns.
Right, and the article mentions these 19th century panics. They sound pretty dramatic. What exactly were they?
Think of them as early forms of financial crises, often fueled by speculation, maybe in railroads or land, that sort of thing. These booms would eventually burst. And back then, without strong financial regulations, these collapses could trigger widespread bank failures, big economic contractions. It was messy.
Fast forward to the 20th century and the big one, the Great Depression. That really forced a rethink, didn't it?
Absolutely. The sheer depth and length of the Depression in the 1930s fundamentally changed how governments viewed their role in the economy.
How so?
It led to a much greater understanding of the importance of total demand for goods and services, what economists call aggregate demand.
Okay.
And the idea that governments could actually step in with spending or other measures to try and stabilize things, that's really the core of what we know as Keynesian economics.
So the big idea behind Keynesianism was government intervention during downturns.
Pretty much. During a slump, the government could increase spending or cut taxes to boost that overall demand and get things moving again.
And after World War II, we saw a long period of growth in many places. Things seemed, relatively stable for a while.
That's right. The post-war era in many developed countries saw strong economic growth, low unemployment. Keynesian policies were widely adopted then, too. Governments were actively using fiscal policy spending and taxation to try and smooth things out.
But then the 1970s hit with the oil crises. That must have thrown a wrench in the works for those ideas.
It certainly did. The oil shocks led to a really challenging situation called stagflation.
Stagflation. That's high inflation and slow growth.
Exactly, a nasty combination. And it was tough for the traditional Keynesian models to explain or fix. They didn't really have easy answers for tackling both high prices and low output simultaneously.
So that opened the door for other theories.
It did, like monetarism, which really focuses on the role of the money supply. Monetarists argue that controlling the growth of money is the key to managing inflation and keeping the economy more stable.
Which brings us closer to recent times, the global financial crisis of 2008. That felt like a huge wake-up call about how fragile the system could be.
Oh, definitely. The 2008 crisis, triggered by the U.S. housing market collapse and then that severe freeze-up in credit markets, it really highlighted how interconnected and, potentially fragile our modern financial system is.
And it led to changes, right? More regulations.
Significant efforts to reform financial regulations, yes. Trying to prevent something similar from happening again.
And then just a few years ago, we had the COVID-19 recession in 2020. That was a completely different kind of shock, wasn't it?
Totally different. It started as a public health crisis. The lockdowns, the restrictions needed to control the virus, they caused a very sudden, very sharp drop in economic activity almost everywhere, all at once.
Wow. Okay, so we've seen this cycle throughout history, different theories trying to explain it. Let's talk about the actual phases. I understand there are 4 main stages.
That's the standard model, yes. Generally, we talk about 4 phases: expansion, peak, contraction, which includes recession, and trough.
Let's start with expansion, sometimes called the boom. What are the key signs? What does that look like?
During an expansion, well, the economy is growing. GDP, gross domestic product, is increasing.
Yeah.
Businesses are hiring more people, so unemployment falls. Consumers and businesses tend to feel optimistic, which leads to more spending, more investment. Factories are busy. Often the stock market's doing well, too.
Any specific example?
The source mentions the tech boom in the U.S. in the mid-1990s. That was a pretty strong, clear expansionary period.
Okay, things are generally looking up. But inevitably, that growth slows. What tells us an economy has hit its peak?
The peak is that turning point. It's the end of the expansion phase. You might start seeing signs the economy is running a bit too hot.
Like what?
Like unemployment might be really low.
Yeah.
Almost everyone who wants a job has one. That can start pushing wages up and lead to inflationary pressures because demand is outstripping supply.
And central banks might react.
Exactly. They might start raising interest rates to try and cool things down a bit. The period just before the 2008 crisis, late 2007 maybe, with those sky-high housing prices and lots of risky lending, that signaled the U.S. economy was peaking before the downturn.
And then comes a contraction. If it gets bad enough, it becomes a recession. What's the official definition of a recession? People talk about 2 quarters of negative growth.
Yeah, that's a common rule of thumb, but the official definition, at least from the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research in the U.S., which is the accepted authority, is broader.
Okay.
They define it as a significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months.
Significant decline and more than a few months. Those are key.
Definitely. They look beyond just GDP at things like employment, income, industrial production. During a contraction or recession, you see GDP falling, unemployment rising, people spending less, businesses cutting back.
In a recent example.
The sharp global downturn in 2020 due to COVID. Big GDP drops, huge jumps in unemployment almost overnight, a clear, though unusual, recession. And just to clarify, a recession is basically a severe, prolonged part of that broader contraction phase.
Got it. Finally, after the contraction, we hit the trough. That's the bottom, right?
Exactly. The lowest point. It marks the end of the recession. At the trough, the economy starts to stabilize. GDP might stop falling, maybe levels off.
So things stop getting worse.
Right. And you often see a gradual return of confidence. Consumers, businesses start thinking about recovery. If governments have put stimulus measures in place, they might start kicking in around this time.
Like after the Great Recession.
Yeah, the source points to mid-2009 in the U.S. as the trough after that deep downturn.
Yeah.
The economy started its slow climb back from there.
So we see this rhythm, expansion, peak, contraction, trough. But what actually causes the shift from peak into contraction? What are the triggers for a downturn?
Well, recessions can be set off by various factors, sometimes internal to the economy, sometimes external shocks. One key trigger is what economists call a demand shock. That's a sudden, significant drop in the total demand for goods and services.
Like people just stop spending.
Pretty much, or cut back dramatically. Think back to 2020 and the pandemic. The lockdowns, the uncertainty. It caused a massive drop in spending on travel, restaurants, lots of retail. That's a classic negative demand shock. When people stop buying, businesses suffer, lay people off.
Makes sense. If demand collapses, the economy shrinks. What else?
Financial crises are another major one. If banks get into trouble or credit markets freeze up, meaning businesses and people can't borrow money easily, that could really choke off economic activity.
Like 2008.
Exactly. The 2008 crisis, starting in the housing market but spreading to the whole financial system, showed how a financial meltdown can trigger a deep recession.
And what about prices? Can really high inflation or even falling prices, deflation, cause trouble too?
Absolutely. High uncontrolled inflation eats away at purchasing power. Your money just doesn't buy as much, so people cut back spending. Deflation, a sustained fall in prices, sounds good, but it could be damaging too. People might delay buying things, expecting prices to fall further. That lowers demand, hurts production.
9 examples.
The 1970s oil shocks led to that stagflation we mentioned, high inflation, stagnant growth. It shows how price instability can really hurt.
We've heard so much about supply chains lately. Can disruptions there also lead to recessions?
Yes, definitely. When things like natural disasters, pandemics, or wars mess up the production and movement of goods.
Like we saw recently.
Exactly. It can lead to shortages, push costs up for businesses and consumers, and slow down overall production. The disruptions after the war in Ukraine and the lingering COVID effects on global supply chains in 2022-23 certainly added to inflation and growth worries.
Okay, one last potential trigger. Can governments or central banks themselves sometimes, well, mess up and cause a recession?
Unfortunately, yes. Policy mistakes can happen. How governments handle spending and taxes fiscal policy, or how central banks manage interest rates and money supply and monetary policy. Sometimes actions taken, maybe to fight inflation, can inadvertently tip the economy into recession.
Really?
Well, the source mentions the early 1980s in the U.S. The Federal Reserve really tightened monetary policy to crush high inflation. It worked on inflation eventually, but it's also seen as contributing to a significant recession back then.
So these shifts aren't just numbers. Recessions have a very real, often painful impact on people's lives. Unemployment is probably the most obvious consequence.
That's absolutely right. Job losses are often the most immediate, most visible effects.
The numbers can be stark.
They can. During the 2008 crisis, U.S. unemployment hit 10%, and in 2020, during the COVID recession, over 30 million Americans filed for unemployment benefits in just a few months. It shows how fast and severe it can be.
And it's not just individuals losing jobs. Businesses fail too, right?
Yeah.
Especially smaller ones.
Yes. Small and medium-sized businesses often have fewer resources, less of a cushion to weather a downturn. The source cites data from 2020 showing nearly 100,000 small businesses in the U.S. permanently closed that year. That's a huge blow to communities.
And beyond the pure economics, there's the human toll, the mental health impact.
That's often underestimated, but it's incredibly important. Job loss, financial insecurity, the general uncertainty. It all takes a toll. It can lead to higher rates of depression, anxiety.
Really serious consequences.
Tragically, yes. The source mentions a Lancet study estimating over 10,000 suicides globally were linked just to the 2008 crisis. It highlights the profound human cost.
So when a recession hits, what do governments and central banks typically do? What tools do they have?
They have a few main tools. On the monetary policy side, the central bank, like the Fed in the U.S., often lowers interest rates.
Make borrowing cheaper.
Exactly. Encourage businesses to invest, consumers to spend.
Yeah.
On the fiscal policy side, the government itself can step in. They might increase government spending, maybe on infrastructure projects or boosting unemployment benefits, or they could cut taxes, trying to leave more money in people's pockets.
And sometimes bailouts.
Sometimes, yes. Financial assistance to critical industries or large institutions, airlines, banks, to prevent a wider collapse. We saw a massive fiscal response in 2020 with the U.S. CARES Act, injecting over $2 trillion into the economy.
Okay, the big question everyone asks, can we predict these recessions? Are there reliable warning signs?
The crystal ball question. Well, there's no foolproof method. Predicting exactly when a recession will hit or how bad it will be is incredibly difficult.
But economists look for clues.
They do. They monitor various indicators. One that gets a lot of attention is the yield curve.
Explain that one.
It compares interest rates on short-term government bonds versus long-term ones. When short-term rates become higher than long-term rates, that's called an inverted yield curve, it has historically been a pretty decent, though not perfect, predictor of a coming recession.
Interesting. What else?
Things like the Consumer Confidence Index, how optimistic or pessimistic people are feeling, and the Purchasing Managers Index, or PMI, which asks businesses about production, new orders, things like that.
But still, it's hard.
Very hard. Remember that quote from economist John Kenneth Galbraith? The only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable.
Right. A bit cynical, but it makes the point.
It highlights the inherent difficulty.
So maybe no perfect prediction, but central banks definitely try to manage things to smooth out these cycles.
Yes, that's a key part of their job, trying to moderate the peaks and troughs.
How do they do that?
During booms, if inflation is rising, they might raise interest rates to cool the economy down, prevent overheating.
And during downturns?
They usually do the opposite. Lower interest rates.
Yeah.
And sometimes they use unconventional tools like quantitative easing or QE.
QE. What is that simply?
Basically, the central bank creates new money electronically and uses it to buy assets, usually government bonds. The goal is to push down longer-term interest rates even further and inject liquidity into the financial system, encouraging lending and investment.
We saw central banks raising rates aggressively recently, right?
Yes. The Fed in the U.S. and others raised rates quite sharply in 2022 and 2023 to fight high inflation. That's a clear example of trying to manage the cycle, though it also sparked fears it might cause a recession. It's a tricky balancing act.
It sounds like the way we analyze all this is constantly evolving, too. Are there newer tools or approaches?
Absolutely. The explosion of data, big data, and advances in artificial intelligence are giving economists new ways to track the economy in almost real time.
So AI can spot patterns faster.
Potentially, yes. Identify turning points or stresses that might have been missed before. Also, the field of behavioral economics is important.
How does that help?
It brings in psychology, understanding that people and markets don't always act rationally. This helps explain things like market bubbles or panics, adding another layer to understanding why cycles happen.
It's clearly a complex topic, managing these cycles. What are some of the big ongoing debates or challenges?
Well, one major one is government debt and stimulus. How much government spending is helpful during a recession versus how much is too much?
Right, the debt issue.
Exactly. There's debate about whether large stimulus packages, like those in 2020, 2021, might fuel inflation later on or create unsustainable debt burdens long term.
And I've heard the term moral hazard mentioned, especially regarding bailouts. What's the concern there?
Moral hazard is the idea that if you rescue companies or banks from the consequences of their risky decisions,
They might just do it again.
precisely. If they think there's a safety net, they might be encouraged to take excessive risks, knowing they might get bailed out if things go wrong. That was a big criticism surrounding some of the 2008 bailouts, that it might incentivize future risky behavior on Wall Street.
Inequality is another huge topic. How do recessions affect different groups?
Unfortunately, recessions often hit lower-income households the hardest. They usually have less savings, maybe work in more vulnerable sectors.
And recoveries?
Recoveries can sometimes disproportionately benefit those who are already better off, especially if they own assets like stocks or real estate that tend to bounce back strongly. The years after 2008 saw widening income inequality in many places, partly for this reason. Asset prices recovered faster than wages for many.
And finally, in our globalized world, problems in one country don't stay contained, do they?
Not usually, no. Economies are so interconnected through trade, finance, supply chains. A major slowdown in one big economy, like China recently,
Yes.
well, its post-2022 slowdown had noticeable ripple effects globally on demand for raw materials, on manufacturing everywhere. It shows how shocks can transmit across borders.
So wrapping this up, it seems these economic cycles, the ups and the downs, are just a fundamental part of how market economies work, not necessarily a flaw to be eliminated entirely.
That's a really important perspective. While downturns cause real hardship, many economists see cycles as part of a dynamic process. They can clear out inefficiencies, shift resources to new, growing areas, and even spur innovation in the long run.
And understanding them isn't just for the experts in ivory towers. It's relevant for everyone.
Absolutely. For business owners planning ahead, for investors managing risk, for individuals thinking about their careers and finances, being aware of the cycle helps make informed decisions.
We really hope this deep dive has given you that solid grounding, that understanding, without burying you in jargon.
Yeah, hopefully cutting through some of the noise.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with directly from the source material. It's not whether a storm comes, it's how prepared we are when it does.
That's powerful.
Especially as we look at future challenges, AI disrupting jobs, climate change impacts, political uncertainty. That idea of resilience, being adaptable, seems more crucial than ever.
Indeed. And if you want to keep thinking about this, consider questions like, how can you best protect your own finances against a downturn? What's the role for international institutions in stabilizing the global economy? Could things like universal basic income play a role in cushioning future shocks? Lots to ponder.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it's been a valuable and insightful use of your time, giving you a clearer picture of the economic forces shaping our world.